Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon everyone. Donc aujourd'hui nous aurons une conférence de Susan Crate. Today we will have a conference from Susan Crate. It's very complicated to introduce the people we really admire. It's compliqué de présenter des gens qu'on admire beaucoup. I'm very touched that Susie accepted to talk with us and work with us, so it was really nice. C'était vraiment un grand honneur pour le CERC et pour l'UVSQ, représentant ici par notre VP Recherche, qu'on puisse être ensemble aujourd'hui avec Susan Crate. In June 2018, we were in Yakutsk with Natalia, and Natalia is a PhD candidate that just completed their thesis yesterday. Donc en juillet 2018, on était à Yakutsk avec Natalia. Natalia est une candidate à la thèse qui vient de terminer, donc elle n'est plus candidate à la thèse, elle est docteur maintenant. And we were meeting people to talk about permafrost thaw. Et nous rencontrions des gens pour parler de la fonte du permafrost. And there was a kind of a tune that came back all the time. Did you speak to Susan Crate? And then we would say no. Well, you better. And so we discovered that we had made a first faux pas, which was not to speak with you before we go in the field. Et donc, il y avait une ritournelle à laquelle nous étions confrontés tout le temps à Yakutsk. C'était quand on parlait de la fonte du permafrost, on nous disait « Mais avez-vous parlé à Susan Crate ?» Et on nous grondait parce qu'on ne l'avait pas fait avant de venir. Mais maintenant, ce sera fait. Now it will be done. Susan is professor at George Mason University of Cognitive Anthropology and Climate Anthropology. And Susan est professeure d'anthropologie cognitive et d'anthropologie du changement climatique. And I let you with her. Je vous laisse avec elle. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Paul. I'm embarrassed that I don't know French, so I'm going to give a nice French thank you here.
Je tiens à exprimer ma sincère gratitude à Jean-Paul pour m'avoir invité à siéger au comité de Natalia et à vous présenter aujourd'hui. Merci bien.
I know that's kind of silly, but I couldn't resist. So yes, I'm very happy to be here. Was very excited about Natalia's dissertation. Very excited that there is more qualitative research, more of an understanding of how local people are thinking about, understanding, and responding to the effects of climate change. I think it's the most important thing we can be doing now as social scientists. And today I am going to give you a presentation that really focuses on my book. Jean-Paul, could you get a book out? He's going to advertise for me. No, I'm just kidding. No, but I just published a book in October, a few months ago, and it's very much a culmination of my work for 30 years with Vilu-i-Saha, and I will show you where they are in the world and talk about their origins, etc. But in many ways, it's a coming together of my understanding of their deep relationship with the land where they live. Deep relationship that probably maybe some of us have some of an understanding, but anthropology helps us to really fathom what that means for people on the ground and gives us a sense of what exactly might be in their minds as they watch the land and the nature around them change very rapidly in climate change. So I will begin. And excuse me for reading. I will be here for a few hours if I don't read, because I will go off on all kinds of tangents. So this is a way of keeping me in the time. As you read this song text, notice the sense of longing. It sings about an alas, a place of deep cultural meaning for Saha. Anastasia Varlamova wrote this song based on her own life living near her family's Alas. Here is a second song of longing for Alas. This one is by a man named Baibal. He is of the generation after Anastasia Varlamova. He spent little time on his family's Alas, but nonetheless, the images and the sensory depictions relay a similar longing for and attachment to the Alas. What is Alas? According to Pekarsky, a Polish ethnographer who was exiled to Siberia and lived among Saha for many, many years, wrote the first dictionary of Saha language. He defined Alas as a meadow or a spacious field surrounded by woods, a Piedmont valley, a long, clear glade among the forest, a field or meadow surrounded by forest. His definition continues with a myriad of colloquialisms, common expressions, Alas types, proverbs, and many toponyms, as you see here, and also a riddle. So the diversity of meanings of Alas helps us understand the important meaning that this landscape has for this culture. Through ethnographic research, I brought forth this multidimensional meaning of Alas for Saha. And now, so many years later, things earlier in my research become clear to me. For example, the sacred flight of swans at the 1992 festival, which signified how the ancestors were returning to their birth Alas. The Minister of Culture's insistence of walking the circumference of his birth Alas before departing in the helicopter. The understanding of how Saha lived by the Alas in family clan units prior to the collectivization of the Soviet period. As my understanding of the sacred Alas grew, I began asking inhabitants about it. And these are the kinds of descriptions they lent to me. These articulations cast the Alas as an otherworldly place, imbued with lush, abundant, and vibrant nature. Yes, Alas is a physical place, but it is also a sacred vow with the ancestors, an entangled, interdependent set of relationships between human and non-human animals, plants, lakes, glades, and spirits. In the last few years, I began hearing different descriptions of Alas. These new depictions are coming to life because Alas are underlain by a type of permafrost that is ice-filled, and that ice-filled permafrost is rapidly thawing due to climate change. And Alas are transforming before Saha's eyes. And inhabitants are taking notice because of their intimate indigenous knowledge of their homelands. They see how the once flat lands in the outlying areas are transforming. Regional scientists are also taking note, and the thermokarst development is especially pronounced on the former fields of the state farms. This is a slide from my collaborator Alexander Fyodorov showing a former state farm field. The thermokarst is the term for the above-ground phenomenon that you see here, the land appearing to be bubbled. The international permafrost community is also paying attention, here using the 1990 to 2000 changes in permafrost temperatures across Eurasia to project the thaw that is coming for 2040 to 2050 and then for 2090 to 2100. Whoops. And the international media has also begun to tell the world about this transformation. However, the spiritual and cultural meaning of Alas for Saha are missing from these scientific warnings and these media stories. And this is my inspiration for my book, Once Upon the Permafrost. Overall, I argue that we need all relevant knowledge systems to begin to tackle the issue of rapid permafrost thaw and climate change overall. I use ethnography to show Saha and Alas as a case in point. I'll give you a brief overview in this presentation, but first some geographical and cultural orientation. So on the left you see the massive country of Russia that spans 11 time zones. And the larger map is a close-up of the Saha Republic, which takes up 1/5 of the area of the country of Russia. Saha's Turkic ancestors transmigrated from Central Asia around 900 AD to the shores of Lake Baikal in southern Siberia, and then north along the Lena River in the Genghis Khan period over 500 years ago to settle in these Alas areas of the Saha Republic. There are two main Saha groups. The group that I work with are Vilui Saha, named so because they live along the Vilui River in the western part of the Republic. And here you see the regional center of Suntar, and then my two main research villages, Elgay and Kutana. The ecosystem is a boreal forest, or a taiga, dotted with alas, as you see in the left-hand picture, which are defined as cryogenic lakes, or lakes on permafrost, surrounded by hayfields that transition to forest. Saha adapted a horse and cattle subsistence that they brought with them from the south to this extreme continental climate of over 100 degrees Celsius temperature change annually. Beyond their physical adaptations, Saha's historical cosmology ascribes all of the world as sentient. The rocks, the trees, the water, the land, the alas, all are spirit-filled, and all require proper interactions and relations to be successful. In the first chapter, I explore Saha's indigenous knowledge of permafrost. One example is the Belus. You see here, it's an underground freezer that utilizes the permafrost. Early colonizers documented Saha's use of these Belus, as you see here, documented in the Bering Second Kamchatka Expedition, 1733 to 1743. To this day, Saha have used Belus to store foodstuff in the temperate months, but now they use them less and less as the permafrost thaws. Abandoned Belus entryways are seen throughout the contemporary villages. For example, this one here, which I took a picture of because this struck me on my way home one day to my host's home, at how the juxtaposition of the abandoned Belus entryway and the modern school behind it visually depicted the rapid change that it's occurring in these rural areas. A second example of permafrost knowledge is tar. Tar is a sour milk concoction that took up nutrients from leftover and waste foods. Saha utilized the cold to preserve it through the winter months. So notice the man standing there by these huge slabs of tar. This was a way that they could use the soured leftover milk from their animals and bring the bones and the waste from their meals and then use it as a soured kind of porridge in the wintertime. And then Saha's linguistic heritage contains clues of their long-term permafrost knowledge. These words that you see under these images describe the different processes of the permafrost. And these words actually make up the foundation of contemporary scientific terminology for the various stages of permafrost thaw today. It is in also this first chapter that I also document the more recent history of scientific permafrost knowledge. In the next chapter, I explore Saha's indigenous knowledge of Alas. Historically, Saha moved between a winter and a summer home. The summer home was called a Sailik. And when they first arrived in their Sailik, Saha did a ritual called Salama Iyahana. Family members hung a salama, lit a fire, and fed their best foods to Wat Ichite, the spirit protector of the fire, while one member sang algis, or sacred words. Salama is a braided horsehair rope with cloth strips and birch figures. It is a gift to the sky deities and an invitation for them to visit the middle world and to be present during this welcoming. Saha had intense knowledge of Alas, which they needed for pasture making. They made more land to increase their pasture and their fodder. One of several approaches was draining an existing lake. So among the different approaches they had to making more land was draining a lake. And this was a complex and dangerous process. It involved expert knowledge of the land and the heavy work of canal digging. But first and foremost, it required spiritual intervention. The draining of an Alas lake involved appeasing the spirit of the lake with the proper words, sacrificial foodstuffs, rituals, and blessings. Once the proper rituals were performed, the work involved the digging of canals from the existing lake to adjacent waterways in order to drain the area. In this chapter, I also document the more recent history of scientific Alas knowledge. If we consider the indigenous knowledge and the scientific knowledge of both permafrost and Alas, it is clear that one knowledge system was developed for subsistence survival and is integral to a people's belief that is rich in cultural history, depth, and meaning, while the other knowledge system, the scientific knowledge of Alas, was focused on specific physical technicalities and was largely developed for economic purposes. Oops, wrong button. Okay, whoops, too far. Here we go. Following those two chapters, I begin the exploration at the local level, where I work in two base villages, Elgay and Kootenai, as I mentioned earlier. I dedicate chapters 3 to 5 to the contemporary ethnography in Elgay and Kootenai. I soon discovered that each village had what some referred to as an Alasni patriot, or a patriot of the Alas. In Elgay, it was Ivan Gerasimovich Ivanov, known by the pen name of Ivan Noller, who dedicated his life to writing about Saha and Alas. And in Kootenai, it was Nikolai Inokentievich Ivanov, known as Kola Uchuto. I will tell you more about them later. Elgay is also home to a village museum called Toydach Alas, which literally means clayey Alas. And here are two of the 4 maps that greet you at the entrance, showing how pre-Soviet inhabitants lived by the Alas. So on the left, you see actually the place of the present-day village of Elgay. The little trapezoidal black shapes represent a homestead, and you can see by this depiction that the homesteads are fairly spread out across these lake Alas areas. In the right is a map of Ugutkul, which was also inhabited, as you see, pretty densely with homesteads along the Alas. Today, this is used as the main place to celebrate the big summer Uhak festival. In chapter 3, I document how local and regional histories continue to shape these two settlements to this day, especially the Soviet period. And I focus on local personalities who played a large role in that shaping of the settlements. Chapter 4 gives insights to how contemporary inhabitants understand change in their own lives in its many forms. I begin with representing understandings of historical change. In other words, how do local people today understand how the changes of the past generations have brought them to this day? Among other changes, we see also how climate change is challenging Saha's particular adaptation to their extreme climates. Here are two of the many expressions that inhabitants shared about those changes. And integral to understanding the changes due to climate alterations is integrating other drivers. For example, in this quote, we see how inhabitants are haying less and less. So as Natalia explained yesterday, it's not just permafrost thaw or climate change that's challenging these rural settlements, but also the inhabitants are challenged by a myriad of changes. Youth outmigration, socioeconomic change, geopolitical change, and the like. One of the more pronounced observations was that of local permafrost thaw. I heard this repeatedly, and I asked if it was possible to be able to see some of these landscapes that inhabitants told me about. Now here I have a little, let me see if this works. Where's the sound? Nope. I got it. Yep. I think. So this is a father and son who we work with a lot with in Kutana. And the son had talked about this area. He goes regularly to duck hunt in the areas far beyond. But the father here, as you can hear his voice expressing his surprise, he has not been back here for about 10 years. And they're talking about how the road would go straight through here. It was a completely flat area. And Gosha is talking about, as he bats away the mosquitoes, he's talking about how these huge dips in the land are here. Yeah. He does know a little English, so he does speak a little bit about the thaw. So he's talking about how it used to be a completely flat, wonderful field. About 10 years it's been like this. You can tell by the trees that are growing in the holes. In the next chapter, I explore life histories. I go in depth with 12 inhabitants who possess a special expertise. And I begin with one of the more profound life histories for me. Snow is a horse's home. Valerian is a Silgi-hit, or a horse breeder, professionally. And he taught me about the intimate connection that horse breeding has to Saha's extreme ecosystem. Each meeting since then, he has repeated to me the same mantra, Kar Silgi-jiate, or snow is a horse's home. In addition to the importance of the right amount of snow and weather conditions, another key to survival for horses is kancheri, the grass that grows after the July hay harvest. It's about 6 inches of green hay that grows, that stays green under the snow in the winter. And this is what the horses are digging for throughout the winter. They live outside all year round. And it's important for them to have the right amount of snow to dig, to stay active, to stay warm, and to find the hay they need to feed themselves under the snow, the kancheri. Before climate change, kancheri could be found all winter, but now it rarely grows due to climate change effects. Another of the 12 life histories was of Maria, or Marusa, Likhanovna Ivanova. She brought the ideas of tar to life for me. You remember tar from an earlier image, with her detailed description of making tar in her youth. Marusa praised tar's health-sustaining qualities. She could not recall many instances of colds or other sickness, even though back then they went barefoot from the spring melt until the first snowfall in the autumn. I was asking Marusa how the seasons had changed over her lifetime, and she taught me one of Saha's pre-technology adaptations. Marusa remarked that the difference between winters of her childhood and now was that she no longer heard the sound of cold. Timni Tihargar. Other life histories in this section include the life histories of a fisher who refined weather observation skills, of a lifelong hunter, and others. This chapter culminates with the life history through the eyes of his daughters of the local Alasny patriot, who I mentioned earlier, Nikolai Innokentyevich Ivanov, a man who, despite the Soviet period push to erase Saha understandings and beliefs, he dedicated his life to documenting historical inhabitants on the local Alas. He painstakingly documented inhabitants' knowledge of their ancestral lineages and the exact locations of their ancestral Alas. Part of his work also included teaching the Kutana school children about Alas, leading field trips to the Alas, teaching not only the ancestral history of each, but also how to observe the changes in the Alas. His daughters made a point to say that it was because of his crystal clear penmanship that they were able to transcribe his work and print the 2 books that they have created focusing on his work. The last 3 chapters that I spoke about drive home the deep understanding and continued commitment Saha have to their Alas. This intimate knowledge, this intimate indigenous knowledge, is critical in the bigger picture of how longitudinal ethnographic findings matter. They provide the inroad to understanding how the complex global drivers of change are coming into and affecting not only the physical world of Vilui Saha, but also their cultural and their spiritual worlds, their ability to continue, albeit in a more virtual form today, to live by the Alas. Likewise, they also make clear the important role of engaging scientific knowledge of changing permafrost and Alas in concert with these local understandings, ultimately ushering in the necessary innovations and adaptations for the future is about the ability to engage all available knowledge systems. Chapter 6 focuses on my collaboration with Alexander Fyodorov, permafrost scientist at the Melnikov Permafrost Institute in Yakutsk. I've collaborated with Alexander since 2005. We conducted knowledge exchanges with the local communities of 8 settlements in the Vilui regions in 2010. I begin by discussing his deep concern for the pace of permafrost thaw in the last few years. This prompted me to request a field trip to the central regions, where Alexander's work has largely focused. So in the winter of 2018, we went to the central regions. And I had been to these regions about a decade before, but I was shocked to look out the window and see landscapes like you see here, with this very advanced thermokarst development. We conducted knowledge exchanges in 2 settlements, and we found opinions very similar to those that I had found in Elgay and Kutana. One story that Alexander shared with me that I found particularly important in terms of understanding inhabitants' determination to remain in their homelands despite the increasingly profound thermokarst development was when he traveled to one settlement that is situated near lands that are not underlain by ice-filled permafrost. So For those of you who might not know, permafrost does not always have ice in it. It sounds counterintuitive, maybe, because it's called permafrost, but there are permafrost types that are just solid rock, solid frozen rock, or solid frozen sand. So the permafrost now that is the most threatened in terms of the warming, of course, is the permafrost that has ice. And these are exactly the types of permafrost under these areas that Saha use for their horse and cattle breeding that we've been talking about. In this map, the dark blue areas are areas where there is not ice-filled permafrost. So in a village close to these blue areas, Alexander created a plan for the village in order to protect themselves from the danger of this increasing thawing permafrost. He encouraged them to establish 10 or so homesteads for young families in this area of the blue so that they can begin the transition and not end up in dangerous conditions. Following his lengthy explanation, which included an economic breakdown of how they could do this feasibly, they thanked him very much and said that they would remember his idea in the future, but for now they would stay where they were. It is also in Chapter 6 that I explore Alas as what is called a cultural keystone. Cultural keystone is a designation attributed to an ecosystem feature that represents cultural significance, like Alas represent for Saha. Chapter 7 brings this focus in the very local ethnographic present into global significance through descriptions of other research projects that I have done and how Saha's story of ice dependence, or their dependence on there being a cryosphere or a frozen component to the ecosystem where they live, is a shared need across the Arctic and even in other ecosystems. For example, my research in Mongolia shows how, although permafrost in Mongolia is discontinuous, so it's patchy, it's not everywhere, and perhaps not as prominent a feature to the ecosystem as in the Saha Republic, it nonetheless is critical in maintaining the grasslands the herders depend upon. During the dry months, for example, the permafrost literally waters the grasslands. In Nunatsiavut, Labrador, my research shows how the communities there are also ice dependent, a very different kind of ice. They depend upon the Sheena, or the ice edge, where they hunt their seals and other sea mammals and also fish. However, in the last decade, the ice is not there as it used to be. On the Chesapeake Bay, watermen, traditional oyster and crab harvesters, are observing increasing sea levels that are due in part to the thawing of the Earth's cryosphere, the permafrost and the glaciers of the world. And a similar story is found in Kiribati, an island nation on the South Pacific, where I was only briefly during the shooting for our documentary film, The Anthropologist. And lastly, in Peru, where we also shot part of the film, where communities are impacted by rapidly shrinking glaciers, for which they depend solely upon for their agriculture, drinking water, and other uses. In all of these research contexts, I had the opportunity to understand how communities have adapted and continue to adapt based upon their indigenous knowledge. Botanist and indigenous scholar Robin Wall Kimmerer offers her reflections on the matter in her book Braiding Sweetgrass. She contemplates what she calls the energetic reciprocity between the complementary colors of purple asters and goldenrod. Through this, she challenges us to consider the complementarity of indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. Here is a visual depiction that I helped to create for the 2019 IPCC Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. I share a book excerpt with you. changing, this is from my book, not from the IPCC book. They would probably not say this. Changing how scientists and policymakers consider local knowledge and indigenous knowledge is but one step of many that are needed to relinquish the hegemony of science toward a more inclusive world. In my work, this means translating other ways of knowing the environment into a form that makes sense to scientists, policymakers, and the wider public. Ultimately, my goal is challenging the hegemony of scientific knowledge and neoliberal solutions, quote unquote, to climate change by bringing to light the depth and breadth of different ways of knowing the world. My central tenet: we need to engage all relevant knowledge systems to find enduring solutions to our shared predicament. This includes revaluing and repatriating indigenous knowledge and local knowledge systems, both through policy changes and indigenous activism, within a world from which they were systematically disqualified and subjugated. The planet is one interdependent biosphere and a dynamic and interacting ethnosphere, the sum total of all the thoughts, dreams, ideals, myths, intuitions, and inspirations brought into being by the imagination since the dawn of consciousness. Humanity's great legacy, all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as the wildly curious and adaptive species that we are. That was a quote from Wade Davis. Our human planet is a systematic patchwork of culturally diverse ways that humans have interacted with their environment and each other and innovated to adapt to change over time, both deep and recent. The direct and enduring interdependencies between our planet's patchwork of biological and cultural systems means that permafrost's demise is in all of our backyards. Permafrost provides one of the main structural foundations for Arctic ecosystems, which in turn work with the other planet's ecosystems to maintain planetary balance. In short, we all live on permafrost. Therefore, its loss matters to us all. Merci beaucoup, Martin Abin. Thank you very much.
I'm gonna give distribute word for question in order to not turn this microphone into a COVID diffusion. Very efficient mechanism if one is. I will repeat the question. So, questions.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very interesting. Maybe if I speak up, it's already.
No, because it won't go online and people are following online.
So I have two questions, if it's all right. Firstly, in relation to kind of Russian permafrost science and more indigenous permafrost science, you had this recent book by what's her name?
Oh, yes.
By the history of
Chu, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there, in this, she traces kind of the history of the concept of permafrost in Russia itself. Is there also a change in Saha knowledge of permafrost that is kind of interrelated with that, maybe through the educational system that is changed?
Okay.
Alongside of that? And maybe the second question?
No.
No?
I will give you after because I will forget. How do your results relate to the result of Chu?
Yes.
In terms of evolution of knowledge on permafrost shore as a culturally determined element between Sakha, Russian, and indigenous knowledge. Okay. And the second question?
Yeah, the second question maybe on preserving permafrost. You have now some really wild projects relatively close to where you did your research. Pleistocene Park, maybe you heard about that.
Oh, yes,
To
of course.
reintroduce the wild. What is the indigenous perspective on this? Do you know this? And are there kind of similar kind of ideas around?
Did you say, so you're asking what is the local interpretation of Pleistocene Park or of preserving permafrost?
This Pleistocene Park, and are there equivalent kind of ideas amongst the indigenous community
Okay.
themselves to prefer, because they're
Yeah.
maybe different.
Okay.
And could you share with us what would be the take of indigenous population of projects such as the Place to St. Park project?
Okay. So, yeah, Pei Chu has probably last summer published a book called The Life of Permafrost, where she is a historian, so she does a lot of archival research, etc., to really trace how this phenomena of permafrost came to be in the scientific world. So, of course, she talks about how it was very much a phenomena within Russian science before it was a phenomena within other global science areas, largely because Russia, if you look at the permafrost maps, or you remember the permafrost map that I showed, a huge amount of Russia is in permafrost. And because you have to understand permafrost in order to do anything on the landscape, building houses, building huge apartment buildings, mining gold, diamonds, silver, which the Saha Republic is rich in, you have to understand it. And that was the reference I made to how the scientific understanding of permafrost was very much focused on economic development, the whole reason for it. Whereas the Saha understanding of permafrost was very much focused on subsistence and being able to adapt to this extreme environment and be able to continue horse and cattle breeding. So for my own understanding of inhabitants knowing about permafrost, I can say very surely that between the summer of 2014, 2015, and 2018-19, the education or people's understanding of permafrost increased greatly. And this was largely because of the intense nature of the thawing of the permafrost. And there were many articles in the newspapers, there was coverage of it on the news about permafrost. And so people gained an understanding of it. Prior to that, though, there was definitely an understanding of permafrost, and I talk a little bit about, in my book, I talk a little bit about how when I first came to visit and I went haying with a family to cut hay in the summertime, and they would store the food we had for lunch behind an area where the trees were, and I found out that it was an area that had access to the underground where it was cool. So the use of it, women should not sit on the ground because of the cold. It will make it so that they're not able to have children, etc. So were understandings of permafrost, and of course the Belouse that I've already spoken of, and the use of the freezing. The second question was?
Plasticine Park.
Oh, right. Okay, Plasticine Park. So Sergei Zimov has been very instrumental in trying to recreate the grassland that existed and bring back, I guess, mammals of the time. But I guess I myself wonder if this really is a good way to try to preserve the permafrost. If you remember the one slide that I said was the aerial shot of a State Farm field, you remember all the bubbles in the field. One of the reasons why thermokarst, or the development of those bubbles, is faster in that place is because during the Soviet period they plowed the field. They took away the buffer, the natural buffer that protects the permafrost. So a lot of Alexander's work, Alexander Fyodorov, when he goes out and talks to communities, as I already mentioned, they do not want to leave their homeland, even if the land is opening up and creating lakes right next to where they live. They want to try to stay. So for example, he will encourage them to, when it snows, shovel all the snow off of their yard because the snow insulates the ground, keeps it warm. So they shovel all the snow off their yard, which exposes the permafrost under the land to the cold temperatures of the winter. As you can imagine, this is quite an energy-intensive practice, let's say. So people are trying to find ways. They're building houses that have that are above the ground with soil there to keep the warmth of the house from going down into the soil. All kinds of ways they're trying to protect the permafrost. But in my mind, I think it's one of these processes that has been brought about by climate change that I think is probably very difficult to even slow down, if not reverse, or to reverse, if not slow down, however you want to say that.
And have you heard any responses from the people there to Pleistocene Park, or is it too far away, too tiny?
Well, when I mentioned it to Alexander, he just shook his head, so I guess that was enough of... I mean, I think from his own experience and the rapidity of the thawing and the development of the thermokarst, it's hard to think that something that would take so long would be a solution.
Other questions?
Don't be shy, please. Ask questions.
Yorgos, please.
I waited a little bit because I tend to have complicated questions.
Uh-oh, okay, I'm ready.
No, you see. Unusual. I heard your vocabulary.
You heard what?
Your vocabulary, your use of certain Occidental words.
Okay.
And I found it difficult to translate correctly their conception of the interior world or the invisible world. That does not really correspond with the spiritual. In the sense that for us Occidentals, spiritual is immaterial as opposed to the body, and for them the internal world, the invisible world, and the visible world are continuous. So I was wondering if there would be a way to circumvent this problem and give away the wrong impression to people from Occidental cultures. And it's exactly the same with, I think it was mentioned in your abstract, or the abstract of your talk, the fact that when you hear them speak of knowledge, it's infused with religious or symbolic elements, because they don't separate. You see, there's not just one piece of material knowledge and another one which is superior or to spirit.
Yeah.
It's a single word, whereas we have different essences since my ancestors, my Greek ancestors. And it's, I feel that we are not faithful to their beliefs and their, the way that they inhabit the world. We try to go around and describe it, but I have the feeling that we are not faithful to the difference, to the profound difference, because Europeans have separated things. Knowledge is
So what is your
detached
question?
from the land.
What is your
I'm
question?
going to give the question.
Oh,
The question is, what do you feel about this difficulty? Because
Oh,
when you speak about
okay.
spiritual elements or spiritual adaptation, climatologists, what does that actually
yes,
bring across?
I understand.
That's my
Okay.
difficulty.
Yes, I go.
Yes, so the question in a nutshell would be what is your feeling and how do you address the issue that in Western languages, the wholeness, the unicity of the world, connecting nature, culture, spirits, non-spirit, how do we manage not to betray other worlds which we interact that are more whole in these other vocabularies, language, etc.?
So,
And this comes with our implicit superiority. which is
Yeah, well,
another tradition.
I think that for me, explaining it by talking about knowledge systems, which I think you're, describing our scientific knowledge. We've broken everything apart into little bits, and we've become experts in one bit. And we don't see the essential connection that we all have. And I think it's in part the reason we have such a problem with environmental issues, is because we do not notice, recognize, and appreciate our own connection to the natural world. And we're trying to do environmental education and bring ourselves back to that. But I think that if we talk about scientific knowledge as being that kind of knowledge, we talk about the quantitative process, the way of kind of quantifying everything and putting it into maps and diagrams and charts, as opposed to the qualitative aspect, which is much more challenging because it does engage that spiritual aspect. It engages, you ask a question in different places in the world and you'll get a different answer based upon that qualitative aspect, that spiritual aspect. And Saha's understanding, and again, it's not that they are living in some past, some out-of-date, primitive past. It's that they have this understanding. They're living in the modern world. They use modern technologies, etc., but they understand in a deep way. And this was something I only really understood by being there, doing ethnography for a long period of time. Because people can say one thing and they do another. So really, to understand, you can't just do interviews, you've got to live and observe what people are doing. But I share your frustration. But I think that in some ways, for example, Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweet Grass, other scientists are, I think, coming around to understand and appreciate the sentience of the world, that it's not just about measuring and analyzing the quantitative aspects of what's going on, but it is about perception and the connection to the natural world. So, yeah.
No, I totally agree. I'm just saying when we are faced with, we're doing this kind of work and we're faced with climatologists.
Yes.
How do we actually communicate?
Well, yeah, and I talk about in my introduction my experience working on the IPCC, which in some ways was a good example of this, because I worked on chapter 1 of this special report, and the chapter 1 is basically the framing for the rest of the chapters. So IPCC, if anyone does not know, it's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's been giving assessment reports of climate change since the early 90s. They've just released the 6th assessment report. And if you're interested in this, if you look at the 6th assessment report, which is completely available online, it is filled with indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, much to our, but we have to take credit for that, because in the special report on ocean and cryosphere and a changing climate, we very directly framed indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, and it was a challenge. I sat in my chapter 1 group when we first met each other. We were in Fiji for the first meeting, and everyone was going around the table introducing themselves. One person was an oceanographer, the next was a climatologist, the next was a limnologist, and then I say I'm an anthropologist, and they all look dead-faced at me like, what are you doing here, right? But luckily there were 2 other people in our group who also were social scientists, and over the process of the 2 years which it takes to create one of these reports, and the back and forth and the sharing of information, people came around, and they actually ended up really vouching for indigenous knowledge and local knowledge and the importance of it. So I think it's a matter of time, and I think it's, a scientist, a natural scientist, is trained in a certain way. And so it's important to be able to show that there are other ways of knowing. So that's my thoughts on the subject. Thank you for a good question. All questions are good, so please.
Jean-Michel?
Following with your answer, I would like to ask you, because I think we are many here that are convinced that knowledge production is essential. So what do you have as advice to foster this knowledge production that is essential to face the challenges? That's my first question. And the second question is about, you said in a previous book that we should not be as scientists overconfident on the capacity of local people to adapt. I remember that. And what about them, the people, the startup people? How do they manage their emotion with facing these changes, many changes in their world? How do they feel about their confidence in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Good questions. What did I say? You said I wrote something? Sometimes I forget what I write.
Confidence on people's capacity to adapt.
We should not be overconfident.
Yeah, that people.
Oh,
there's
okay.
a limit of adaptation.
Yes, okay. So about the co-production of knowledge, what do I suggest? I think that there are many ways to facilitate the co-production of knowledge. So what is co-production of knowledge? If you don't know, it's really talking about, it's moving from the kind of way of the researcher of going in, gathering all their data and leaving. It's changing that, which is already, of course, in social science, it's already very much the norm. Now that you go in and you collaborate with local people, you understand that they have a knowledge about their place, their history, what is going on in their world, and your orientation is more about wanting to know what they think about what is happening. It depends on the topic that you're looking at. So co-production of knowledge is much more about being able to leave something and also to be able to work with communities to help them. For example, I guess the example would be the knowledge exchanges that we did that I did with Alexander Fyodorov in 2010, because he has this very deep understanding of permafrost and permafrost thaw from his scientific training and his field work. And I was also very aware that the local people had very specific and detailed, intimate knowledge about how climate change was coming into their local environment and affecting them. And so in these knowledge exchanges, we first asked people in the audience to get up and talk about what they're seeing. So instead of going and telling them about climate change and how it's going to affect them, we said, your knowledge is important. You know very detailed and specific information that is valuable to the scientific community, right? And then Alexander Fyodorov was able to show landscapes that were familiar to people in the audience, landscapes of these alas and how it's changing, etc. So, so the co-production of knowledge, if you ask about how do we face these challenges that we are facing, it depends on how you think that process would end up. If you're hoping the process would end up in some kind of a definitive answer for people, I think it's more about the process. So we're not looking for an end result. We're looking for this collaboration, this process, and that's not comfortable for many people. Many people want to know, how are we going to end? What's going to be? But we can't say that, right? That's why I think there's such a propensity for modeling. What's it going to be in the future? How's it going to play out, right? And that's important in some way. But I think we underplay the importance of the collaboration and the interaction with other ways of understanding the world, where we don't exactly know what the end product will be, right? We're not the magicians who are going to come out with some final result, right? So I think for me, my experience is that it's about being in that sort of mystery of where we are and of engaging those other ways of knowing and trying to be helpful, to be helpful to link maybe people with knowledge they need and understanding their knowledge to help other people know what is going on for them. That's part of what I do with my work. And then your second question, how, I can't even read my own writing. What was your second question? How to manage?
How people manage
Yes,
emotion
okay.
facing their world changing.
So,
Their confidence in their
yes.
capacity of adapting.
So there are several things I want to say here. First of all, the people I work with, the local inhabitants I work with, they think about the future, but not the way we do. And as I just mentioned, you know, we have this desire to know. We want ground under our feet, literally. We want to know that, you know, things are going to be okay, whatever that means, right? And that's, I think, a human tendency. But because, as Natalia was also sharing yesterday, there are so many other challenges that people are facing in these rural regions where they don't often have the luxury to think about the future as much as we do, right? They're faced with challenges of how they're going to feed their family, how they're going to pay for this or that, how they're going to get water or keep their animals this winter because there's no cancheri under the snow, etc. The other part is that Saha, as a culture, are they don't complain. That's the word I guess I want to use. They want to be able to, they get through things. They're very good at adapting, and they often will work very hard to make things work as they are. So you and I could go there, we could see these images of the permafrost thaw and think that we will get to the villages and hear people saying, what are we going to do, what are we going to do? It's not the case, right? They're very much trying to work with it from one day at a time. Is that an okay answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions, please?
I see Natalia raising your hand. Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if within this context of daily adaptation, if there was any space for them to think about needing the help from external actors like the government to adapt in a broader sense, or if they do it only on a daily basis and maybe at a community level. And
yeah.
the second question is, I don't know what was your experience, but during my fieldworks, I would often be asked to come back and to keep conducting research and to help them maybe producing small booklets with recommendations for them to act. So I was wondering if you encountered that kind of requests from the community, like
Yeah.
to bring something back or to do something.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, outside help. So When I did the initial climate focus groups and interviews in 2008, 2006, 7, 8, it was a period of a lot of water. So in the Saha understanding, there are these cycles in their ecosystem of wet years and dry years, and it is proven. This indigenous knowledge of these water cycles is also scientifically shown to be true. So in those early years of my climate research, a lot of people were, one of the complaints was the water on the land. They talked about the flooding of the lands. And in fact, there was a lot of water on the land, but they explained it because of these cycles. But obviously, it was outside the cycle. It was more water than usual, and it lasted a longer time. So finally, they needed to have some help. As you saw from the landscape, it's very flat. They wanted some help with the government to dig canals to drain these areas. And this became very chaotic because they hired people who did not really know the land, quote unquote. There were a lot of complaints that they didn't consult the local elders who knew the land and how they needed to dig the canals, etc. So there was a request for help there. In terms of the permafrost thaw, which is on people's minds a lot now, it's very hard for people to understand how the government could help them with that. They've given them a lot of understanding and knowledge about it. Alexander Fyodorov is trying to help educate people about it. But it's a tricky issue to understand how anyone could help them besides funding them to go and live somewhere else. But that, of course, relocation is really not an option for most local people. In fact, in the 2006-2008 project, and when there was so much water on the land and people were not able to harvest enough hay to keep their cows because of all the water, I actually asked a question in one of my questionnaires: if there's too much water, if there continues to be too much water on the land and you cannot keep cows, will you move somewhere else? This was a Likert scale where you have statements and people say, I agree or I don't agree. So one statement was, if there continues to be too much water on the land, I will move somewhere else so that I can continue to keep cows. And another one farther down in the series of statements was, if there continues to be too much water on the land, I will stop keeping cows and do something else. The majority of people agreed with that last statement. So for me, that said that the connection to the land and the attachment to that place and the cultural history and heritage that people have was more important than leaving. And in terms of, yes, of course, people love these booklets that help them understand. And in fact, after the 8 knowledge exchanges in 2010, most people said we should do these in all the villages, but we could not physically do that, so we created a booklet. And we wrote it with the collaboration of the communities. It took us 3 years to complete it. It tried to replicate the knowledge exchange process. It brought information to people and helped them appreciate their own understanding and knowledge of the changes that were occurring, and it was in the Saha language. And so we would bring it back every summer and have their input and their ideas, and then finally we were able to publish 3,000 copies and distribute them throughout the Vilui regions for that specific. So, yeah. And I'm hoping that this book also helps a bit. I have a colleague who just had her book translated into Russian, and I'm hoping that maybe we can do that and maybe into Saha, who knows.
Shall we call it a day? Okay.
None of the young students in the back have questions? Come on now. No, I was looking at you. I'm assuming you're younger students, but maybe I'm wrong. I can't tell anymore, you know. I've gotten so old, everybody looks young.
Below 50, you all look alike.
Ne pas de question?
I could ask another, maybe
Please.
about historical change. You mentioned this in one of your first slides.
Yes.
And just out of curiosity, what is their conception of the people you interviewed of historical change in comparison to how we see?
Well, it's very profound. They talk about how, as you saw in some of the quotes, their grandparents had to make everything themselves. So there's been tremendous change over the period of their lifetimes. And in fact, when I did my dissertation research in 1999, I interviewed 54 elders who remembered living by the Alas. It was before, they remember their early homestead before the collectivization. So the Soviet Union, the October Revolution was in 1917, but the actual collectivization of these production systems, these horse and cattle areas around these Alas did not happen. The first collective farm was not made until 1929. There was a long period there of the organization of this. And many of the elders at that time remembered those early periods of everything was done by either human or animal power. There was no electricity, no motorization, etc. So people today remember how their ancestors talked about making everything themselves, but they said that it was a hard life, but they were happy. I mean, they, you know, I guess it's relative, you know, to what you know. And people reflect on how much has changed, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, with the influx of Western culture and access to media, etc. So they understand and appreciate that there has been a lot of very profound change. And a lot of it also comes into the, you know, what is the future of horse and cattle breeding in these areas, because many of the people are people who are doing this intensive daily work are no longer able to, and their children are not taking it up, because it is a lot of work, right? So change continues.
And do they frame this in a sense, well, essential to kind of the Western way of looking at things, and also the Soviet way was the idea of progress. Is this also a term they recognize in this, or is there more of a holistic sense?
Yeah, well, it depends on who you talk to. There is still, as Natalia also mentioned, there is still this nostalgia for the Soviet period, and a lot of it has to do with the Soviet period being a time when everyone had work, everyone got a paycheck, most things, a lot of services were free, the socialist system was very much alive and well. But again, you know, you have to ask yourself what was the economic basis of that system, which was, you know, probably not sustainable in the long run. The Elgay State Farm was one of the biggest farms, got all kinds of metals, had all kinds of animals there. But it's obviously a very delicate ecosystem, not able to sustain that kind of production as it was going at the time. Younger people are very happy about the fall of the Soviet Union. They have the opportunity. I mean, when it first happened, there was this real hatred of anyone who was innovative and figured out how to make money. Making money was equal to ripping people off somehow. And I think it was a leftover of that Soviet idea of, you know, everyone being equal, etc. But people have become very innovative, making their way in different forms.
I have one last question. From your experience, I wonder if you have encountered any kind of extra challenges, maybe associated to being a woman, a social scientist. I know you've been in different fieldwork, so I was just wondering, any different way of being treated, or certain limitations while conducting fieldwork because of that?
So in the Saha context, as I mentioned, I first visited there in 1991 and came back to do my thesis, my master's thesis research on the festival in 92. So 30 years. I also married a local man and learned the language, which kind of brought me under the wings in many ways. So I've always been, well, actually there are some people in the village who only just recently told me that they now understood I was not a spy. But those are the few and far between. For the most part, I've been very lucky and fortunate to be able to work in these settlements for such a long time. And of course, in the process, I have very long-term relationships with many people, very strong friendships and associations, and feel, you know, this also makes me feel incredibly responsible for what I do in terms of their welfare. In other places, I have not really felt any kind of limitation because I'm female, but I think it's probably because I've mostly worked in places where that's not considered a limitation. Does that make sense? What about you? Did you feel, except for the fact that you couldn't go to Bukowski?
Well, yeah, it was a bit annoying, but yeah, I guess sometimes it's better not to take unnecessary risks in that
Yes.
moment. But aside that, no, that's no experience.
This time I'm going to call it a day because we're reaching at the 2 p.m. limit, and culture will be used for other purposes. So thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you for having me.
Your time.
Thank you for coming, everyone. And
It's a wonderful talk. And thank you to the organizer. I don't see Annabelle in the room, but please come to my next to her. She's the central organizer of all these logistics and sandwich buying and thinking and poster designing. So thank you to OVSQ for making it possible. Yes, I will thank everyone. I need also to thank the funding sources for part of this outside of OVSQ, which is a Master 2 degree in corporate social responsibility, which we hope will trickle down and people will stop changing the plan for others. But most of all, thank you.
thank you. I appreciate it.